How to select engaging and meaningful curriculum. The agenda for this content talk will include how we need to really focus in to see children, to understand not only their interests, their strengths, but also instructionally and emotionally and socially their needs. And then we want to examine how we can organize curriculum. Curriculum is organized really on a continuum of teaching, and we will look at how we can find topics for organizing curriculum, authentic curriculum that is, in our own backyard. And then we'll finalize the session by thinking about integrated curriculum considerations for selecting developmentally appropriate curriculum topics. One of the things that's important when we start working with young children, birth through third grade, is we really need to understand and see children for the competent, capable, really amazing learners that they are, despite other challenges that we may face as we're working with children who present various interests, various ways that they want to interact in the classroom. So there's some questions we can ask ourselves to really help us guide our own actions in the teaching process. So how can adults become familiar with what children are most curious about? So what are some of those things that we might do to really understand children's curiosities? What processes enable adults to really understand what children's strengths are and how best to offer learning opportunities that will build on these strengths? And what tools help teachers consider how children learn and develop? That is, across typical developing patterns, yet with individual rates and attention to how learning and development is heavily influenced by the child's social cultural context. These are important guiding questions that should help us really stop and be present in the moment with children through conversations, through positive, warm interactions in the classroom where we turn and are thoughtful about the things that children are saying and doing. Most importantly, that doing is very important for us to really hone in on. We can observe the children often in their free choice time, in free play, in their own spontaneous interactions or responses to things that they're doing in the classroom that will really help us understand them deeply. One of the things that we can do, we can really practice the skills of slowing down and looking for the details of children's intentions and intelligence. This means when we slow down as the teacher in the classroom, we really pause and take in the moment, what are children saying and doing with one another, with themselves, with us? We can study photographs and descriptions of children to carefully build our view of children's competence. This is important. Sometimes we're more in tune with what children aren't doing, and then that focuses in on us really kind of having a negative stance about development. I think this is reflected in some of the way we categorize children's test scores. You know, being below basic doesn't sound like any label I would want, certainly as a learner. And so how can we study children's work and their interactions carefully to see them for competent and capable learners? We can observe children routinely, so being systematic in our approach to authentic assessment and gathering data on children is really an essential way of helping us to slow down because we prioritize the listening, the observing, the watching, the side-by-side investigation that can take place when teachers are routinely capturing how children are learning, what they're learning about, and really what they're talking and doing, and how they're representing. So we can use a thinking lens to reflect and study and understand the meaning of observations in the stories that we collect. At the end of this content talk, you can go and look for the Thinking Lens attachment that I've placed on Blackboard. This is by Deb Curtis and Margie Carter. And in fact, the idea of intentionally slowing down in the classroom and looking for details of children's intention and intelligence is a part of their work from their book called Really Seeing Children. But we also need to have tools for understanding children deeply. One tool that is very valuable is a simple record-keeping tool that can help us organize the anecdotal notes that we need to be taking every day. This is a Project Construct framework tool. I have also attached that to the week-by-week folder so that as you are organizing observations of your focus children, you can be utilizing a tool that provides an in-time organizational component that will help you really understand children deeply across different developmental areas. There's another tool that is really helpful for understanding typical patterns of development in young children. That tool is called the DRDP, the Desired Results Developmental Profile. This is an early childhood developmental continuum that was created and has been scientifically tested. When it first was created, it mirrored what we know from our developmental psychologists. When we think about Jean Piaget, when we think about Lev Vygotsky, and other constructivist theorists, what the DRDP developers were able to do is to look at the patterns of child development that we have learned about, and then they were able to validate this within the field. So this tool really organizes how we can see children's strengths and capabilities across important learning domains. So when we think about learning domains or developmental domains, some things should come to mind. For example, we should think about language and literacy domain. Cognitive domain, which is typically then later on in school broken down into subject areas like math and science. There's the physical developmental domain, and physical development includes things like health, nutrition, physical play, gross and fine motor development. There's the social-emotional developmental domain, which includes types of learning such as sociodramatic play, building relationships with oneself and with others, and then also building social interactions and social-emotional understanding. Then there's also the learning domain that is children's approaches to learning and their capabilities of utilizing the characteristics built within executive function and even those 21st century learning skills such as curiosity, taking initiative, having self-control and self-regulation of behaviors, being able to engage and persist. Those are some of the measures that are a part of the developmental domain. So what you're looking at on the slide right now is called Measures at a Glance. It is what I like to call a table of contents of all the measures that are within the DRDP. The DRDP is widely used across the United States now. It did originate from the California Department of Education, and they utilized several research entities within the state of California that are very involved in the development of tools and literature and promotion of developmentally appropriate practice for early childhood education. It is now the tool that is used commonly across Head Start classrooms and many classrooms actually in the state of Missouri. It is a developmental continuum, which means it starts off in this preschool comprehensive view. You will see what the skills look like in toddlerhood all the way across the end of the pre-K year. So if you're in kindergarten, you want to choose the DRDP kindergarten measure. And then there's a school age measure that then works across the different grade levels. This tool is very similar in terms of how we think about other tools for learning standards, but there is a key difference, and that is this tool will break down each one of the measures. So as you're looking at this, if you can see, this is really for a teacher to understand the layout of the tool. So you see the different color-coded areas. The domain, the first one there, it's a little puzzle piece, approaches to learning, self-regulation in blue. Then it goes to SED, which is social emotional development with the heart. And then it goes to the book in yellow, which is language and literacy. The first four of those measures or standards, you could call it, those are language standards, oral language development, which we know is the foundation for reading. And then 5 through 10 is the literacy standards that would reflect things like alphabetic principle, phonological awareness, concepts of print, those key components to the foundations of literacy. Then, if you work with English language learners, dual language learners, you would utilize the 4 measures that go with the blue globe there for English language development. If your children speak the same language as the language of your school, then you would not utilize these if they're the language in the English language. So if the child is English speaking by nature of their home, then you would not use these. Then you have cognition, which includes math and science measures. You can see those are numbered 1 through 11. Again, the numbers are just organizing numbers for the teacher. So for example, I've used this so frequently over the several years of teaching on the project approach that when I'm brainstorming the measures that I'm going to integrate, because we want to integrate standards into project as we build that curriculum, I know right away, oh, okay, we're going to focus on classification. Classification is most always a part of some early project work activities. So I'm like, oh, Cog 2, that's what I'm going to build in. It's kind of like a classroom teacher that's been using the Missouri State Standards for so long. They're able to have that abbreviation and numeric pattern within the standards memorized. So this is a little bit about the layout. I'm going to place the DRDP online so that at our week-by-week content so that you can look more fully through it. Here's a picture now of when I mentioned earlier, the one thing that I really like about the DRDP is that it's already scientifically rubriced for you. When we just pull up, for example, the Missouri State Learning Standards, we have the standard that we know we're going to teach at that grade level, but it is not itemized across the years of development in that particular age level. So, for example, this is LLD 10, which stands for Language and Literacy Development. You can see that labeled at the top left-hand corner. And then this is the measure for emergent writing. The definition comes right below that. Child shows increasing ability to write using scribbles, marks, drawings, letters, characters, or words to represent meaning. So then you go start at the left-hand side, just like you would read on a page or a book. Moving over to the right, you can see that there are 9 incremental levels there, from responding earlier, responding later, to exploring earlier, middle, and later, to building early, middle, and later, and then to integrating. So what this is representing is really children's development. So the left-hand side are infants and toddlers, and then we move over to the exploring, where this is probably where we're looking at ages 2, 3-year-olds. And then as we move across, by the end of the preschool year, this is what we would expect typically developing preschoolers to be able to do, write several words or phrases and recognize approximations. It should be noted that integrating earlier is also what we will see within the kindergarten year. So this is really helpful to interpret where children are developmentally. And it mirrors what we know about developmentally appropriate practice, how we believe as early childhood practitioners, and we understand, it's not just that we believe, we understand that there are developmental levels in which children then have individual and cultural rates of development. And so this enables us to really interpret well as we are really seeing children and really listening to children and really examining photographs and work samples to see what are children doing. The way that the DRDP is utilized is to help interpret all of the authentic assessment data. So if you were creating portfolios of your classroom students, you'd be looking at all of these measures, and then you would be having multiple data points for each one of these measures. The way that we utilize it in our class is that we're going to have activities, and we're going to have these as the standards of the activities, and then we're going to interpret that work based on the standards. So for example, when we can say, we can look at some work and we can say, oh look, there are circles and there are marks and there are drawings of the child's family, and the child has even made some statements about, oh, this is my family, this is what I'm writing. So then you look through and you're like, oh, this really looks like it's building earlier, because they're not just making marks and scribbles anymore, they've added in those pictures. So that's just one example. As we move into continue to thinking about how you're going to create authentic curriculum, it's important that we remember how to organize curriculum, how teachers currently organize curriculum, or how curriculum is organized in schools. So we think about this continuum from teacher-centered on the left to child-centered on the right. So the farther that you're moving with integrated concepts around a topic, and then when you're teaching through that thematic work, and then you're actually getting to really questioning and investigation, and then it's completely the child's orientation of those questions, we move from single concept teaching to project learning. So all of these represent good ways to teach, and all of these actually may be happening within one school day. That's also something to keep in mind. Single concepts is when we as teachers know I need to teach this skill. It's usually a single skill or a single concept that must be taught or modeled directly. It's kind of like when we think about preschool children. They learn how to say please and thank you because we've taught them directly within that context, not necessarily had them ask questions and investigate and research. Integrated concepts. This is when we have a lesson or an activity where the teacher is instructing and the skills are integrated. This is a good representation of the Things I Like activity, where we're integrating emergent writing with oral language skills. And the teacher is picking the context within to teach those skills and support those skills and elicit those skills from children. Units, we can most often think of units with a content area like mathematics. You know, in math you have your measurement unit. Now it's time for addition unit, etc. Those are usually very short time periods on a narrow topic. Thematic teaching is something that's very popular in early childhood and primary grades. Thematic teaching, for example, in October, if you walked into a number of kindergarten or preschool classrooms, you would probably see pumpkins. So that's an example of where you may have a theme, and everything that is happening in the classroom may have something related to that theme, or you may use that object or that thematic topic to integrate into other things, where it's not actually learning about pumpkins, but maybe you're counting with pumpkins, or maybe you're building with pumpkins. Teacher-directed inquiry, we're getting more towards project work. But the difference is the teacher is bringing in predetermined general questions. So predetermined essential questions that do lead to in-depth research and exploration by children, but they're not the children's questions. So the project approach or project learning is when there's an in-depth investigation that can be initiated by children or the teachers, but it's the students' questions and the children's interests that help guide the choices and selection of curriculum learning experiences. This continuum is found in both of your readings this week. So at this point in time, it's helpful to either stop this content talk and take a community walk around your school, or take a mental community walk around your school. I would suggest that when you are in your school, that you do this all the time. Every year you should start out with a community walk just for yourself. You may actually even take your children on a community walk to help discover things that we can learn about. There's a presentation that you may remember on why we do the project approach. And in that presentation on why do projects, there was a picture of the boiler. Do you remember the old-fashioned heater that the children found in their school? And it was so intriguing that that became the impetus of a project. It's happened numerous times for teachers. Preschool classrooms that walk by toddler classrooms, and the older preschoolers see the young toddlers and call them babies and are so intrigued. What emerges? The baby project. Children who walk by and see different cars every day in their parking lot, and cars becomes the topic. One playground actually of a center in the Kansas City area is right by the downtown airport. So every day they were seeing regular flights of planes coming by, and so they began to be very interested in airplanes. So the community walk really helps you understand what the context of your school is and what the possibilities are. However, you really want to keep your mind open. Keep that boiler, keep that old-fashioned heater in your mind as you think about the things in your school, because there are no limits to what children's interests may bring to the teaching and the learning. If you're in a center or a school where it's difficult to take a field trip, this could be because the field trips are already planned in advance and everybody goes on them. Those are really field trips. They're not field site visits meant for investigation that is required by the project approach. So this is another reason to know your community well. For example, I worked with a teacher who was implementing the project approach for the first time. This has been about 8 or 9 years ago. She worked in a pre-K center with preschoolers, and no one in the center had ever taken a field site visit. It just was not a part of their curriculum or resources. And so I talked to her about, let's take a community walk and let's notice what are the businesses directly by the school where it would be safe for children to walk, what's around the school, what's even inside the school. And what's interesting is because the children were interested in chicken, they kept talking about chicken over and over and over again, but they didn't want to know about how, the actual animal that lives on a farm. They didn't want to know about how how a hen lays an egg and then chickens are born. Oh no, they literally wanted to cook chicken and taste chicken, and really it was all about restaurant. And it was when the teacher really did a lot of focusing activities that she discovered that their interest was really in a restaurant. And lo and behold, right next door to their school, literally across an alley roadway, was a barbecue restaurant that was famous for their barbecue chicken, hence the connection to that immediate context. And so since they had never gone on a field site visit before, our long-term goal was to visit that actual restaurant. But before we went, we thought we would take the children to the kitchen in their building. So they had a nice commercial kitchen where the food was prepared for all of the preschool classrooms and infant and toddler classrooms. And so the first field site visit that those project learners went on was to their own cafeteria or their own kitchen, where they interacted with the cooks and the workers that were in the kitchen. And as you might guess, when the children came back from that first field site visit, their dramatic play increased 100-fold. Their topics of their dramatic play was enriched with new vocabulary, and they wanted to recreate that kitchen in their own family area, in their own house area. And so then, as more experiences happened, grandmas were bringing in different kinds of chicken for them to taste. That's when they finally went to the restaurant. Once they were at the restaurant, they transformed their dramatic play area space yet again, and that's when it really was focused on restaurants. So we take a community walk to help us learn about our environment, to help us know what the possibilities are and also what the resources are. For example, if your school has a comfort dog, as many schools do now, that's a potential project topic where children can interact with the service dog. They can interact with the service dog's person, the counselor, whomever is in charge of the dog, and have multiple visits and interactions within their own environment. So those are the types of things to consider as you think about project topics that are available in your own backyard. Now let's review the considerations for selecting developmentally appropriate curriculum topics. One thing that I want you to keep in mind is we are learning how to use the project approach as a tool to enact the most optimal developmentally appropriate curriculum. But all of these processes and criteria that we will review actually reflect any sort of emergent curriculum or child-centered curriculum choices that you're going to make. There are other approaches that you could take for integrated curriculum that is child-centered and emergent. We utilize the project approach because it does such a nice job of capturing all of these processes, especially for individuals who maybe haven't had experience utilizing constructivist practices before. So these can be applied through other approaches. If you do talk to me personally, or if we see each other in a face-to-face class, I am going to say that I believe that the project approach is the optimal way to be able to deliver developmentally appropriate curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So now it's time to think a little bit about the reading reflection questions. When it comes to the considerations for selecting developmentally appropriate topics, and we have to think about, well, how does that make a topic be accurate, relevant, and meaningful? One of the places that is important to look at is in your green textbook on page 17. It outlines important criteria in topic selection through a list of questions. So one of the ways you may have answered this question, one, is with questions. Questions found in figure 2.3 on page 17 can be very helpful in identifying a topic that has the best potential to develop into an effective project. The teacher should be able to answer yes to most of these questions. So is the topic anchored in children's own experiences? Does it help them to understand and appreciate their own world? So I always give this example of dinosaurs. Children love to play with dinosaurs. They love to play with dinosaur puppets, read dinosaur books. They love to have little dinosaur manipulatives in the building area that crash and roar and fight one another. But dinosaurs aren't in children's real experiences, in their own real world, because they're extinct animals. And we're going to look at the distance to self diagram in a little bit to help us understand that extinct animals really are not parts of topics that we're going to study in preschool, kindergarten, or primary aged classrooms. Again, children can read about them. I've even worked with preschoolers who are the age of 3 who can say pterodactyl before they can really speak in full sentences, who actually have memorized all the different types of dinosaurs, which shows brilliant learning and exquisite interest. But let's find a topic that is really something that they can explore, talk to, and investigate that's real in their world. Does the topic add enough value to the children's experience to justify the educational time devoted to the topic? Are there items and processes within the topic that encourage children to examine things closely, to observe with accuracy? Does the topic provide opportunities for children to use a variety of skills during investigation? Does the topic provide experiences related to the topic that would enable children to develop dispositions, those intellectual dispositions? Is the topic more concrete than abstract? So a good example of that is fire truck versus fire safety. Fire safety can be kind of abstract to a preschooler, but the fire truck is a physical object that can be investigated from multiple angles over and over again. They would actually learn the concepts of fire safety by investigating the fire truck, but because you start with the concrete, it's much easier to move to the abstract. Is there an abundance of first-hand direct experiences in real objects? Judy Harris Helm always recommends, if you're teaching a project topic, try to have 25 authentic artifacts. That doesn't mean your books or the videos that you might show children. Can children do their own research with minimal assistance? Can the topic be researched without relying on secondary sources such as the internet or books or videos? Are there authentic artifacts and processes that children can study firsthand? Does the topic have related field site visits nearby or experts that we can interview? Is the topic culturally relevant to the children and their families? So for example, when I was working with a preschool classroom that was in an urban setting, and the children had been listening to storybooks and singing songs about the farm because they had traveled to a pumpkin patch about an hour away, it may not be culturally relevant to study the farm, but it may be culturally relevant to study the ducks that visit the pond in the park right outside their school every day. So you have to think about which topic is related to the area the children live in every day. Does the topic further the children's core understanding of the curriculum and the age-relevant standards? There are some other practical considerations. When you think about the readily available artifacts, objects, or items, so if you were going to do, for example, a doctor project, do you have a sling or a stethoscope that would enable young investigators to explore the phenomenon in ways that are most effective? So they can touch, they can move with it, they can carry it, they can play with it, they can hear, they can manipulate it, etc. It's difficult for young investigators to think about topics for which they have little background or vocabulary. That's why it's so important that it is related to their own experience. Judy Harris Helm writes about the topic boats might be appropriate for young children who live around boats, but may not, and have had some first-hand experience, but it may not be the best topic for children, for example, who live in a very land-oriented geographic area. So when we think about a meaningful topic, we think about how it's accurate, relevant, and meaningful. So think about in your own words, how does that relate to a developmentally appropriate topic for the project approach? When we integrate curriculum, there are essentials for selecting DAP topics. Standards. Are the standards going to be anchored in this topic? When you read Chapter 6 on Laura Taylor's camera project, one student noted, "I can't believe how many standards were able to be connected to a topic like cameras." Assessments. Can I document children's learning individually and as a group? Is there a student-centered child interest for this topic? Will this topic help fulfill children's academic and emotional needs? Is there a balance of teacher and children activities? Are the resources going to be available that are authentic artifacts? Is the topic authentic? Is the topic developmentally appropriate, meaning that it's age appropriate for these children? Is it supportive in the environment? Is it supported by the environment? Is it culturally relevant? Does it help children really investigate, research, problem solve, and think with little direction from the teacher, but a lot of guidance from the teacher so that it may focus on critical thinking? Can families be involved in meaningful ways, such as field site visit experts or experts that come to school? When it comes to selecting topics, Bess Jean Holt was a researcher and scholar who first wrote about integrated curriculum several years ago. In her article about integrated curriculum, she discusses thematic teaching and she discusses how to pick topics. That is a supplementary article that you can read to supplement your studies this week. When you look on page 16 of the Green Young Investigators book, you can see this diagram that's shown here on the slide. This diagram is called the distance from self diagram. And this was Bess Jean Holt's conception of the child being at the center of their world, right? And a young child being very egocentric, being very focused on their immediate now, their immediate space and time, their immediate world. So there are concentric circles there that you can see around the child. The first immediate circle is the toddler's world that contains words like warmth, food, care, shelter, space, now. Moving out, it's supposed to be blue, but it shows up on my screen as light green. That is around the midpoint there. Those are the preschooler's world. So the preschool and the toddler world can be related. And you see lots of different terms: gardens, groceries, pets, storms, yard, neighborhood, housing. As those concepts are organized, notice that there is like a pizza pie there. And so where you see the large, broad topics in the squares, people, things, places, weather, time, change, animals, plants, those are the broad organizing categories. We are not going to have a project over animals. I've had a unit over animals before I knew better. Now I know better. So we're going to be narrower in our thinking with units, with thematic teaching, and with project topics. But all of the concepts that are written inside these little pizza pieces connect to time, change, animals, plants, people, things, places, weather, connect to those overarching. Then if you look to the outer edge, you can see larger disciplines of study like zoology, microbiology, botany, nutrition, genetics, medicine, sociology, psychology, anthropology. Those are the studies, the disciplines that are related to those broad concepts of time, change, animals, plants, people, etc. Those would be studied in high school and in college. So when it comes to helping us determine if the topic is going to be age appropriate and accurate to the child, we can use this wheel to help determine its accuracy in terms of the distance from the child's current understanding of their world. That also helps us understand. So the relevancy helps us understand when children have experienced some of the topic before and the interest is there. And it's meaningful when there's a balance of integrated curriculum and content standards that can be taught. So when we look at the distance to self diagram, it can be helpful. It is not all inclusive. Every possible project topic is not listed on this wheel, but we can use it as a helpful tool to make discernment, to discern what we would pick. So for example, I want you to find the center of that wheel, child's self. And I want you to go to the right towards things. And when you go towards things, you're going to see possessions. So cars, we would say, are a possession of some families. Some families have cars, some families have bicycles, some families use bus transportation, etc. If we notice that children were really interested in cars, and I've taught preschool for many years, and one year I had 14 boys and 4 girls, and you can imagine everybody, including those 4 girls, wanted to play with the cars in the building area. We had all sorts of ramps and different wheels and things going on. When it comes time to deciding, would cars be a project topic, we can say, well, possessions is very close and similar to cars, so it looks like that would work. So again, it's not every single topic, but it can help you. I'm just going to also give you a caution that I give to everyone when I work with them and train them. Very seldom is weather a weather-related topic, something that I've seen that works really well for preschooler and kindergartners. Typically, it turns into activities that are more teacher-based than really research-based. Sometimes you have to wait a lot on the weather, and it can't really be a long-term investigation. So that's just advice coming from someone who's been teaching for a very long time and who has worked with the project approach for a very long time. We see weather of the day, we see all those kinds of prescribed activities, and it just can lend itself. Now, occasionally, to just throw another alternative side in there, I have seen projects where the televising of weather becomes the focus. So the children are actually interested in the dramatic play of being the weatherman. And then they do learn about the instruments and they learn about different types of weather. But the focus really is them being able to communicate weather to others because they are engrossed in the play that's associated with being the weather, being the meteorologist. All right, let's find out what's next. So now, if you took your community walk or you did a mental community walk and listed out different things that you saw or heard in your environment, maybe in a typical school building, you have written things down like this: water fountains, stairs, windows, doors, birds, bird feeders, playground. Maybe you've also recorded things like floors, walls, trees, grass, flowers. Your list could go on and on. One of the things that we do when we're contemplating whether the topic is going to be a fruitful topic is we're merging different points of information. We want to find out if the children are interested. Just because I might see a group of birds that are flying every day to the windows outside of our classroom, just because I'm noticing these, are the children noticing these? Are the children really interested? So even when we have a given topic, we want to test that out with the children, engage their interests. And we'll talk about that later in our studies of provocations. But right now we're going to work with just trying to understand how teachers design their curriculum in a project. We use the teacher planning web, and we're going to use the teacher planning web actually to plan the integrated curriculum project that you will be working on this semester. When teachers plan the project approach, they create an anticipatory teacher planning web. Laura Taylor, who wrote Chapter 6, well, actually her story is in Chapter 6 on the project, the camera project, you can actually see her teacher planning web on page 75 of the Green Book. This is where Laura sat down with her assistant teachers and developed a planning web. This is where they brainstormed and anticipated concepts that children might learn that were related to cameras. Not all of these concepts were known to them. They had to do a little thinking, a little talking. Sometimes we may even have to do a little reading about the topic, especially if we're not familiar with it. For example, squirrels. Squirrels is a topic that young children might be interested in because they may have an outdoor playground that many squirrels visit all the time. But as the teacher, I may not know as much about that animal as I might another. So when I'm anticipating the planning, I'm going to use some processes that are going to help me understand what I know, what more I could know, and then I will do another planning web with the children to gauge what the children know. This is an example of a teacher planning web. It's actually my draft for a shoe project. Throughout the duration of this course, I use shoes as the example when we talk about project work, primarily because Judy Harris Helms has that example in her Burgundy book, The Becoming Young Thinkers text. So when we look at some the refined planning chapter, you're going to be seeing how to step-by-step walk through this creation of a teacher planning web or an anticipatory planning web. So you think about shoes. Just think about that concept for a minute. And as someone who's been teaching for a long time, for me, the ideas flood. They come in instantly. I'm thinking, oh, for shoes. Shoes are all about math because they're different sizes. They are created with different materials. They have numbers on them, right? And so we can think about how shoes have some innate mathematics that go along with them, such as identification of numbers, measurement in terms of different sizes, how we might categorize different shoes, and how we would collect and organize data along with the shoes. We also buy shoes, and so money is involved with the exchange of goods and services, or in other words, making purchases. Some shoes, however, are not purchased. Those shoes are found as donations or handed down from family members. So that leads us to thinking about, social studies curriculum and how we have different community workers that provide services to families, or they have their professional business, which could be a shoe store. We also think, when I think about shoes, I think about how there's different uses for shoes. So that could be related to social studies, that different jobs that people do or different hobbies that people have lend themselves to needing different kinds of shoes. So once you think about all of that, you can start to map these things out. I've been doing this for a long time, and there are lots and lots of ways to approach creating a concept map or concept web about the topic that you're playing with. We're playing around with the topic shoes right now, and there's some tried and true categories for the concepts of the topic. And I've pointed to two of those on this slide with the yellow arrows. Where do we get shoes as a concept? Types of shoes or kinds of shoes as a concept. Characteristics of shoes is a concept, and uses of shoes is a concept. We take those concepts and then we break them further down. Now, technically, I could improve this web by putting circles around all of the lines that are forming out from the concept, and then I would further go out with additional lines, really creating this to be a concept web. Let's just take a look at characteristics of shoes. You can see how there's sizes, which is a characteristic of shoes, there's materials, and then there's parts of a shoe. Those are three distinct characteristics of shoes. From there, I can operationalize that further. There's different fasteners, there's different parts. For the materials, I can list those out. So that's what you do as you're brainstorming. Then you start integrating in, as you can see with some of my squares with dotted lines around them, you can see how I have integrated and placed where there may be opportunities to integrate standards. I did not list all the possible standards on this initial draft. Rather, I was thinking about ones that might really be predominant that I would focus on. Because I'm working in a preschool classroom, that's the vantage I'm using, I would know that my children would want to do a lot of play in a shoe store. So I'm going to make sure I integrate symbolic representation through play. I also know that young children need to learn to care about themselves and to take care for others. And shoes help us stay healthy and help us take care of our bodies. So I'm going to integrate some social studies and social emotional standards. I also know that math is an inherent concept to the topic of shoes, and so math is really going to be central as a primary content area where we classify shoes, we put shoes in different orders by measuring them. We record numerals related to the shoe sizes of children and teachers in our school and our classroom. And so I'm going to add math and some science or some standards for there. So when you're doing that teacher planning, this is what you're thinking about. Take time to study the camera projects web, and I would encourage you now to go through the process of choosing a topic from your list, from your community walk, whether that's birds, whether it's windows, whether it's the water fountain. And you put that in the middle, and before you put that in the middle to determine whether or not you're going to web it, you're going to look at the topic criteria selection on page 16 and 17. You're going to think about, is this a topic that would be accurate, so age appropriate? Is it developmentally appropriate for the age of the child? Is it going to be relevant? Meaning, is there background experiences that the child may have had already? Is it going to be meaningful? Meaning, are there opportunities to build lots of standards into the curriculum? So let's take an example. Maybe as you were doing a community walk, you wrote down farm because you were in a school where just across the street was a farm. In Warrensburg, Missouri, that can happen quite frequently. In Kansas City, Missouri, that would be more challenging. So the first thing that I would have to think about is farm going to be relevant to my children? So if I'm in Warrensburg and I can see that farm, or and I have a majority of children that maybe have lived around or near a farm, I can say, sure, that's going to be relevant. Now I want to think about, is this going to be age appropriate? So is it going to be accurate for them? Is farm too broad? Is it just right? So if I go to the distance to self wheel and I look at the child's self, and I go out, I can see around number 3 where farms is just barely touching that pre-K, K line. And so, because that third circle is typically some K, some first grade. So for preschool, instead of farms, I might focus in on the ducks on the farm or the cows, and probably not the cows because cows aren't very interactive. I'm just going to say that right now. However, there's a lot that you could do with that one. So I'm just in my mind brainstorming where I might go. It would all depend too on the children's interests. So if the children were really interested in a particular animal on a farm, or maybe they were interested in a particular machine on the farm, like the tractor, I may narrow that topic. If my kiddos are in kindergarten, farm would work. And so I would put that in the middle. So if I put that in the middle as my topic, I'm going to think about the concepts. So let's go with a kindergarten classroom that lives in rural Missouri, and farm is possibly their project topic. What would be the concepts? So maybe who lives on the farm, maybe animals on the farm. Maybe we would have types of crops on the farm. So we would think about the different types of concepts that we can then narrow down. So it could be farm machinery, farm animals, jobs on the farm, who lives on the farm, buildings on the farm. So you want to think in terms of either starting with a question like who lives on the farm, or moving to, which could still be too broad because animals and people are going to live there, or you start with thinking about the different parts of the farm to help you understand those concepts. Okay? So then from there, you would start to add in the different standards. So if we were thinking about the animals on the farm, we would obviously bring in science because we would be exploring the differences between living things and non-living things. We would be able to look at the characteristics of animals, right? We can bring in different types of social sciences because we would be looking at how people are helping how people help the animals, and we would also be looking at the jobs. We'd also be looking at the uses, the uses of the animals on the farm. That would be another connection to science and social studies. So there isn't one right or wrong answer necessarily, it's just a process. And so you go through this process until you really feel confident that you've captured accurately and that the standards are as authentic as they possibly can be. For example, in kindergarten, there are standards for reading that talk about being able to identify the characteristics of a narrative, the parts of a narrative like the setting and the characters and the plot. That's not necessarily going to be a standard that we would have in a project topic. We may read books that are related to the project topic, like I might read a book about a family that lives on a farm that's a fiction story, and children are going to identify the characters and the setting and the plot, but that's not going to be an active, engaged lesson and experience where children are going to investigate and answer their own questions. And keep in mind, it's those questions that are going to drive where you start with the project. For a shoe project, for example, if children were really interested in what are our favorite shoes in our classroom, I probably would start with the right side of that planning web. We would do activities to investigate characteristics of shoes and types of shoes, because my assumption is children being fixated on favorite shoes, that's going to have something to do with the trends. It could have something to do with sports figures. It could have something to do um, with the characteristics of their shoes, like high heels or glittery or shoes that light up. So once we know their questions, then we know where and how we're going to form our activities. But don't jump. Don't do what all teachers do. We all jump to the activities first. Don't jump there. First, think about the concepts and lay them out. So go ahead and practice this. Those of you who are in the online class, practice it out. Send me your map via email and I'll give you feedback on how you have mapped out concepts. I will say, just keep in mind, if you want to know are you on the right track with mapping out one of your community walk topics, email me that too before you get started, because we don't want a dinosaur per topic, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, thanks so much, and look forward to talking next time.